Okay, so today we're going to read the book of Lamentations. Not one of the more commonly discussed or talked about books in the Bible. Actually, I'd put it up there as one of the least commonly referred to books in the Bible. Lamentations is basically a sequel to Jeremiah. It was probably written by Jeremiah, although we cannot say this for certain because the book itself, this Lamentation, this poem, does not name an author. So the author, whoever wrote it, does not identify himself. It would be very strange if it had been anybody else than Jeremiah. Maybe Baruch, maybe. But we know from 2 Chronicles, when it talks about Josiah, King Josiah having died, and Jeremiah having written a lament for him, we know that Jeremiah was a composer of laments. We know that Jeremiah was a weeping prophet. We read in his own book about how much he shed tears for his people and for the message he was having to give them. So he had the ability to write this sort of material. He did write material very much like this in the book that does bear his name and is unmistakably his. There are several linguistic similarities between Lamentations and Jeremiah. And Lamentations was clearly written by an eyewitness. This Lamentations is about the fall of Jerusalem. And it was written by an eyewitness to these events, someone who was in the city at the time and spoke with personal experience about what happened, which of course Jeremiah was. So when you put it all together, it's like Jeremiah is by far the most likely, maybe Baruch, maybe, but there really isn't anybody else that could be. Okay? How many other people in Jerusalem when it fell would have been, and survived, obviously has to be a survivor, someone who survived the fall of Jerusalem, who was there when it fell, there during the siege, saw the siege happen, was there in the city, fell and survived, and wrote down about it afterwards. I mean, that would be a pretty small number of people, period. And how many of them were literate and articulate and capable of writing poems like this, which we know Jeremiah was able to do. So it's like, in the end, like unless there is some mysterious figure that we don't know about and won't know of him until we meet him in heaven, it's pretty safe to say that Jeremiah very likely authored this material. Ancient sources all attribute Lamentations to Jeremiah. The Greek translation of the New Testament, which was written in the 200s BC, even adds a note at the beginning of the book about him having written this. Jewish tradition says that he wrote it. So there's, again, unless there is some unknown figure that is not mentioned anywhere else in the scriptures, and we won't know about this person's existence until we meet him in heaven, very, 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 very likely that Jeremiah, or maybe Baruch, was the writer of Lamentations. But we technically don't know that for sure. The author of Lamentations technically remains anonymous. This is a lamentation. This is a lament about the fall of Jerusalem and the circumstances surrounding it. Some of it is about the actual fall and the state of the city now. As the author speaks, the city is in ruins and rubble. So during this poem, he's going to be talking about several different aspects of this calamity. In his present sense, in his present day sense, the city is in rubble. It's in ruin. It's been destroyed. And so some of his context is about talking about the city as it currently exists to him, which is as a pile of rubble. Some of it talks about the city before it fell and while it was still under siege and what was going on in the city while it was under siege, such as mothers eating their children and things like that, which happened during the siege. So he goes kind of back and forth between these different aspects of the city's disaster, the calamity that came upon them. And he is in mourning. I mean, this is a lament. He is not enjoying himself. And the people in the city are not enjoying themselves. And this is okay. Okay? Now, we read all through Jeremiah, we've read in all these prophet books, that this judgment is from God, and he is doing it because the people have turned against him. He has given them 900 years. I mean, they came together as a people in the 1400s BC. This is now the 500s BC. This is almost 9 centuries later that he has given them to repent. And they haven't done it. So he is long-suffering and very patient. He has put up with these people a lot. And now that the time has finally come when they've crossed the line, their cup of iniquities is full, and this had to happen. It doesn't mean it was easy to take. Jeremiah, remember, when we read Jeremiah's prophecies, he didn't want to deliver this message. This was not a pleasant message. He really struggled with having to deliver it to the people. And even after he finally settled that issue, Jeremiah 20, even after he finally came to grips with that and accepted it, and it was no longer an internal struggle for him, he still cursed the day he was born and was commissioned by God on the day he was born to deliver this message, because this was a message of doom and gloom. This was not a pleasant message. Even after he had made his peace with it, he still cursed how awful this news was. So it was not a good message. And this is a weeping book. It's a book of mourning and lament. And that's okay. It's like sometimes the appropriate response is to mourn and lament. Now, they're mourning over a specific thing that happened to them. Okay. There is something important here about saying that the context of this lament, this grief, is about a thing that happened, an event that occurred, a disaster that actually happened to them. And what that does is it means that their grief is centered on a specific thing. It's centered on like a series of circumstances or an event, a calamity that actually befall them. And the reason why that's important is because when we grieve or we get mad, it can be easy for us. I've done this myself. I know this because I used to be this way. All right, not necessarily in grief, but in anger. When I was a young man, I had a big problem in the sense that I was just mad at everything. This lament is over a specific thing, a specific disaster that occurred. It's always better to, if we have negative emotions, if we have grief or anger, it's always better for us and for everybody to ground that negative emotion in whatever is actually causing it. A specific event, or maybe a problem we have with some kind of person or something. Because if we don't, we can let that negative emotion get out of control and just dominates all of our thoughts all the time. And it goes beyond simply being grieved or angry over something that happened to us or to somebody else, and becomes about just being angry at everything all the time. Or mourning. And I know what that's like, because I lived a good portion of my life this way, and that's not a fun place to be. So in this mourning, in this lamentation, we are grieving a specific disaster that occurred. Now, in our lives, we can apply this sort of attitude to other disasters. I mean, we're not going to be sitting in Jerusalem. We weren't there in Jerusalem when it fell. We didn't have to see the mothers cook their children and eat them. Probably we're not going to see that. I don't think that any of us are likely going to see that in our day and time, unless the world situation falls apart really quickly. I mean, earlier this year we did have a baby formula shortage. I don't know if mothers cooked their babies to eat them, but they had trouble getting food for their babies to eat. I mean, hopefully we won't get to a point where we're literally doing something like that. But whether it's a disaster such as your city being besieged and overrun by a hostile enemy force, or some other kind of disaster that has overtaken your life, this is a sort of grief program that you can go through to help work yourself through these negative emotions. Whether this was written by Jeremiah or not, it was obviously written by an eyewitness to these events, someone who was there and saw it happen. And it was probably written fairly soon after it happened. The emotional intensity of this material seems to demand that it was written relatively soon after the events happened, and the emotions were still fresh and the memories were still very vivid. If Jeremiah did write this, he probably wrote it during the period of time when he was still in the land before they took him down to Egypt, which happened sometime later, probably. But even despite that, despite the fact that it had to have been started at least in the immediacy of the aftermath, when the emotions were still hot and when the memories were still fresh in their minds. But it's also very carefully composed. Like the book that we have, the song that we have of Lamentations, which is made up of 5 songs that we've divided into 5 chapters, it's clearly very carefully curated and compiled into the current form. So there was some thought given to it. It was not just the guy pouring out his soul in the immediate aftermath of disaster and just venting to the air. I mean, it is not that. He may have done that, and some of that material, some of those Some of those thoughts he expressed or words he spoke in the immediate aftermath of his grief got included in his written document later. But this book is very carefully composed and very carefully written, so there was some level of, actually a pretty significant level of deliberation and thought put into crafting this poem. So it wasn't an immediate emotional reaction, but it was probably written still close enough to the events themselves when the immediacy of the emotions were still fresh. We know this because the book in Hebrew, now you don't get this in the English translation, but in Hebrew the book is written in a very tightly controlled poetic style. There's 5 songs or 5 poems, and they build to a crescendo in chapter 3, the midway point. And it's like a pyramid where you start here and you go up here to the high point and you go down from there to the other end. And each of these 5 poems has 22 lines. Well, excuse me. 4 of these 5 poems have 22 lines. The third one has 66. And these 22 lines correspond to the 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. Now, of course, we're not going to get that in English. But each line of the poems starts with a letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So it would be like an English poet writing a 26 verse. We have 26 letters in our English alphabet. So it'd be like an English poet writing a 26 verse poem where every verse starts with another letter of the alphabet, A, B, C, D, and it goes in order. So A, B, C. In our language, it'd be A, B, C, D, E, F, G, all the way down to Z. And I don't know the Hebrew letters. Now, this Bible doesn't have it formatted according to the letters, but some Bibles would. I have a Bible in the bedroom, a big study Bible, that actually has the verses broken down with the Hebrew letter that starts that verse kind of mentioned at the top of it. Some of the Psalms are written this way, too. This is called an acrostic. These sorts of poems where each verse or each line starts with a new letter in the alphabet is called an acrostic. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet. So chapters 1 and 2 and 4 and 5 have 22 verses in them. Chapter 3 has 66 because it has 3 lines for each letter. It's the longest chapter, obviously, and each stanza or each verse has 3 lines for. So you have like A, B, 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 C, 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 D, 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 and all the way down. And the subject matter goes up and down too. So remember how I wrote about Leviticus and how that book was designed to have a midway point, and then you had the beginning that leads, which was the Day of Atonement section, and you had the beginning that leads up to the Day of Atonement, and then the ending which leads away from the Day of Atonement. How that itself was kind of a microcosm of the entire 5 books of Moses. Which you go from Genesis to Deuteronomy, and Genesis is the prologue, and Deuteronomy is the epilogue. And Exodus is about them leaving Egypt, and Numbers is about them trying to enter Canaan. And the midway point is Leviticus. And even in Leviticus, there's a stairway up leading the Day of Atonement, and a stairway down leading away from the Day of Atonement. Like, that's a similar thing here. You've got a 5-chapter book or a 5-poem book leading up to chapter 3, and then leading down, which is where the high point, which is where we kind of reach our. God is great, and God is great in His faithfulness, or however it's said. We'll read it as we go. So there is a careful construction to this poem, and it's not just an emotional reaction to what happened, but there is a lot of emotional intensity in this poem too. So it would have been a careful balance between being written certainly after the events themselves, when the emotions were still fresh and the memories were still vivid. And yet enough time has passed and enough intentional and deliberation has gone on in the mind of this writer that he was able to take these intense emotions and articulate them in a very carefully constructed and compiled series of poems in order to make his point. And it was probably meant to be sung. We don't, of course, have a tune or anything for this today, but this was originally probably meant to be like a mournful dirge. These laments are meant to be sung. I'm not going to sing, by the way. So you're not going to get that from me. I'm not going to sing. But more than likely, this was originally meant to be sung. And the acrostic formula of having every verse start with a letter in the alphabet might have been intended to be kind of an aid in helping memorize the words of the song for the singers who sing it. Okay, I think that's pretty much all the background about Lamentations. I've already been taking about 15 minutes now, so I'm going to go ahead and start a new video, and then we'll get into the book. It should not take us. This is not a particularly theology-heavy book. It should not take us particularly long to get through this. There's not. It's basically just it's a lament. It's a mourning. It's a way to express anguish in front of God, and it's a holy way of doing it. Like it's fine to do this. It's fine to mourn. It's fine to be upset, even when the disaster that is inflicted, that has happened, has been deserved, because you're being judged for your sin. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you're not being judged for your sin. Sometimes when disaster occurs in your life, it's not because of sin. In this case, it was. Okay, when Job laments his wrongdoings or his trouble, it's not because of sin. That's the whole point of the book of Job, is that Job was not being punished for his sin. He was being taught lessons, and he learned lessons through his suffering. But he was not being inflicted with this misery because of his sin. In this case, they are. In this case, this disaster has happened to them because of their sin. But that doesn't mean they can't still be upset about it. Even now, Jeremiah, if he's the author, he himself may have been righteous. Maybe he was caught up in a disaster that he should have not been caught up in. But he's expressing his mourning, his lament. And even if you're in, it's okay to mourn your suffering. It's okay to lament. It's okay to grieve. That is not forbidden. That is not taboo. We do see a few instances in the Bible. We saw it with Aaron and his sons back in Leviticus. We're going to see with Ezekiel and his wife in the book of Ezekiel when we get there. There's a few isolated incidents in the Bible where God specifically tells someone not to grieve the death of someone close to them. But those are very specific, isolated incidents, and that is not the general standing orders that God gives people whose loved ones die or whose lives are ruined in some disaster or another. That is not the examples we have that are exceptions are exceptions. Okay, that is not the rule. That is not the standing order. It is okay to grieve. It is okay to lament. It is okay. Now, there comes a point when it becomes too much. Okay, there does come a point when you're weeping for the sake of weeping, or you're mourning for the sake of mourning, or you're wailing for the sake of wailing. Like I said before, I wasn't mourning. I wasn't weeping, but I was angry. When I was a younger man, I had a lot of anger in me. That wasn't directed at anything in particular. It was just kind of like I was just angry at the world. And you can get to that point if you don't fix your negativity and your emotions and you're on a specific thing that's causing them, where you can grow beyond that and just dominate your entire life and all your thoughts all the time. And that is not good. That is not a proper way to mourn. That is not a proper way to grieve. That is not a proper way to express negative emotions. But there is a way. We have these emotions, and they're not bad. And there is a proper way to express them, and Lamentations gives us an example of that. Okay, so now I think I've done all the introduction I need to do, and I'm going to actually read the book of Lamentations.